Today I want to talk about a hidden feeling that all humans experience, and most of us don't pay much attention to because that's the way the dominant culture of the Western world today operates. And yet, if you were to explore this feeling more deeply, I think it would give you some profound benefits. So I hope you'll stick with me for this video. I won't string you along. The feeling is grief. And before you leave thinking that this doesn't apply to you, I just want to let you know that I have operated that way as well. I have lived a very privileged life. I'm very lucky that I was raised in a wonderful home, great parents, and amazingly, I've been able to go through decades of life without ever losing anyone who's been close to me. I've lost grandparents, but I wasn't close to them, so it didn't really impact me. And so grief is not something that I have had a relationship with until I decided to attend a grief ceremony or a grief ritual last weekend. And this was a 2.5-day long event. It involved a lot of drumming and singing and embodiment, processing grief as a group. And my big fear going into this was, what if nothing comes up? What if I'm okay? What if I don't have any grief to process? Luckily, that turned out to not be the case. I managed to find a lot. But I decided to go to this because, first of all, I'm just someone who is very oriented around pushing myself outside my comfort zone and trying new things. And I really see it as a big part of my life purpose to explore different pathways to personal growth and healing, so that I'm well versed in all the different techniques and ways of approaching being human that humanity has come up with. And then I can share the most effective ones with my community and my clients. And so I'd heard a lot from people I respect about these grief rituals, particularly in the lineage of the one that I attended, and I wanted to check it out. And I also felt personally that there's just been some things happening in my life recently where I felt like something's stirring, like, I feel frustrated about this, but could there be some grief underneath that? So I wanted to check it out. And as I explored this over the weekend, it really hit me just how prevalent loss and what should lead to grief is all around us. Everything that's happening in... sorry, this thing's falling off. Everything that's happening in Gaza and Ukraine, and even just kind of some slower moving things like climate change and layoffs. So many layoffs happening lately, and the loneliness crisis. There are many things that would make sense to grieve all around us. But what's happened is that most of us have numbed ourselves. And it's kind of a self-preservation mechanism. With the internet today, it's so easy to be connected to these painful things happening all around the world. Wow, there was an earthquake on the other side of the world that killed thousands of people. And if we were to let in all these news stories all the time, it might be too much for us to bear. Right? So the numbness makes sense to a degree. You know, back when humans were first evolving and we lived in much smaller groups of people, there was a much smaller amount of suffering to take in, right? If you live with only 100 other people in your village, then it's only 100 people to worry about, not billions of people, right? So it's kind of necessary that some degree of numbing has happened. But I think we've gone way overboard in the numbing department. And one of the things I really appreciated at this ceremony was the facilitators encouraged us. If you get up there to the grieving area and you don't feel grief come up, then what you might consider doing is actually grieving your numbness. Grieving that these other people participating around you who are feeling something, like, wow, that they are able to feel something, but you aren't. You're closed off. There's something in you that's protecting you, numbing you, making you jaded. And isn't that sad? That you are being prevented from feeling more. So can you grieve that? Right? I thought that was pretty profound. And I really came to believe through this ceremony that it's true that grief and joy, or grief and love, are really two sides of the same coin. That I think until we can really learn how to feel grief, we're prevented from feeling the fullness of joy and love. I was struck by a story. Can't remember now if I heard it from the facilitators or from a podcast they gave us to listen to. But anyway, the story was basically that I think it was Francis Weller who was traveling around Africa learning about grief rituals and things, and he would encounter people there who just had so much joy, just such big smiles on their faces, and he would ask them, like, what's your secret? How do you I can feel the joy emanating from you, and they would say, oh, it's because I know how to grieve. I know how to feel such depths of sadness, and that's what allows me to feel the depths of joy. So I really, really believe that. And so I don't want to, this really feels like a sacred thing that I got to experience. I was privileged enough to get to attend. So I don't want to reveal too much about what actually happened there. But what I can say is that it was through an African lineage, the Dagara people in Burkina Faso, in kind of a northern, I think, area of Africa. And the story that I heard is that they were noticing just how much harm the West, was kind of causing in the world, and so they sent some people, Sobonfu Some and Malidoma Some, to investigate and figure out kind of what's happening out there in the West, what's going wrong with these people that they're lashing out and causing so much violence and harm in the world. And what these two discovered was that we in the West don't know how to grieve. We've lost that. And so it makes sense that when we repress all this sadness and we numb ourselves, that can cause us to lash out in anger and cause harm. And so that's where they decided to bring us these tools of the grief ritual from their people, where it's been passed down for many, many generations. And it's just really amazing to me that they explained that, unfortunately, Sabanfu is no longer with us, but she trained these facilitators who were doing the ritual for me that I was able to participate in. And the facilitators explained that virtually every indigenous culture all over the world has used this technology of the grief ritual. Or, maybe not, it might not have looked exactly the same, but they had some kind of regular grief ceremony or healing ceremony where the entire village would come together. It might have been monthly or even weekly, and there would just be drumming and dancing and singing and something to process as a group, as a whole village. And I haven't investigated that claim too deeply, but I did a little fact-checking when I got home, and it seems like it's probably true that pretty much every indigenous culture did this in some way. And it makes sense to me. Today we're so much more separated from each other that we're not as aware of what's actually happening for each other. Whereas back then, and the way that indigenous peoples used to live is, kind of the walls were thinner, right? If someone was wailing next door, you would know it. You would hear it, and you'd be working with them the next day, and you'd see them around, and you knew your neighbors. So it was much clearer that others are suffering. It was harder to escape compared to our world today in the dominant culture. And so it was kind of necessary. Like, yeah, we need to support each other. If others in my village, if my neighbors are going through a really hard time, I can't just ignore it. I need to help them. And then when I'm going through a hard time, they're going to help me. And so it makes perfect sense to me that they would have this technology of regularly creating ceremonial space to process complex emotions as a group. And, certainly today in the modern Western world, we have funerals, but it feels very different to me. I think, with a funeral, certainly there are many people there who feel some grief about the person who's been lost, but there is much more of a focus on the kind of individual grief of, the spouse or the parent or the child or whatever of the person who died. And, most funerals are much more kind of solemn, quiet, serious affairs. Right? Whereas these kinds of grief rituals that I'm talking about in more indigenous cultures are a very different flavor. It's much more about the collective grief. It's not just about this one person, but it's about let's process what we've all experienced. Let's all support each other. It's less like you are sad, you one person, and more there is grief in the air. There is grief energy here, and we all need to process it collectively. I think that's really beautiful. The facilitators said that grief and grief ritual is the glue that holds community together. And I really believe that, because this is 2.5 days and most of the participants were strangers. And yet by the end of those 2.5 days, I felt so close to them. I felt so much belonging, like we could talk about anything. Because there's something about grieving together. If you are sitting next to someone who is wailing and tears pouring down their face and snot pouring down, or they're pounding the ground, you feel that's real. This is a real person. They're not masking. They're not hiding anything. They're not pretending to be something. This is reality. This is raw. And if you let them see you doing that too, that is so bonding. Just the realness of it. We see each other. We see our raw humanness. And Yeah, maybe the only other thing I'll say about the ritual itself is, I think really a core part of it is that there were not defined roles in the sense of, you are the participants who will be grieving and others will just be kind of observing. It was really a constant kind of people filling in for whatever was needed. If you needed to grieve, if you felt something welling up in you, you would go over to the grieving area, and someone else who was not grieving would catch you going over there and would follow you and just hold space for you. They would just sit behind you and not even do anything, just be there so that you could feel another human being, another nervous system close to you, and just know that you were being supported, you were being seen, you were being held as you were grieving. You might ask for a hand on your shoulder or whatever, or just knowing you could always count on that there would be someone there behind you. And then you would finish grieving and you would go back, and then maybe they would need to grieve, or someone else would. They would feel something welling up, and then you might go and volunteer to sit behind them. It was just so beautiful. And for the people who weren't grieving, they would all be singing, dancing, drumming. And that's what supported the container. We would just keep singing this grief song again and again, again and again for hours, and just drumming and drumming, and just feeling kind of that grief welling up in our bodies. It was a very embodied thing. This was not a mental exercise. It was just feeling like, wow, my nervous system, my muscles, something is holding this tension in there. Something needs to be let out. And that's the point of the ritual. So it just feels so important to me that, as a Zen Buddhist, one of the really core beliefs in Buddhism is impermanence, that everything is changing, everything is in flow all the time, nothing is static. And I really believe that's true. You can just notice that firsthand, like your breath is constantly changing, sounds around you are constantly changing, the quality of light is changing, right? Feelings in your body are changing, your mood's changing, your thoughts are changing. And so if that's true, that everything is impermanent, then logically that gives so many opportunities for grief to arise. All right, if things are constantly changing, then things are being constantly lost. New things are being gained as well, of course, so it's not all bleak. But it means that each moment is precious, because the next moment's going to be different. Something's not going to be there anymore. And so when something changes that we wished would have not changed, it makes sense to feel some grief, even if it's not conscious, that there's something that happens in our body and that needs to be processed in some way. So, there isn't any easy solution here, because our modern dominant culture is not oriented around this. We just don't really talk about grief much, right? It's always uncomfortable when you hear someone at work or a friend loses a loved one. You don't really know what to say, right? I'm so sorry for your loss, or, oh, they're in a better place now, right? That's kind of a weird thing to say. Who knows where they are now? And there's just this awkwardness. We don't know the words. We don't know what to do when someone is grieving, because we're not taught. We don't have rituals in the West other than kind of a funeral. So I actually had some grief around that come up during the grief ceremony. Like, wow, I'm so lucky to be here to get to experience this ceremony. And it's so sad that most people I know don't get to experience this, because it really should be a regular thing. So I encourage you to check out something like this. If you ever hear about a grief ritual being offered, I encourage you to give it a try. I found it to be an incredibly powerful experience, and I'm eager to go back. But short of going to a whole ritual or ceremony, I think one way you can start to tap into what I'm talking about here is to find a friend you trust and ask them to hold space for you, to just sit with you as you try to tap into some grief. You can ask them to put a hand on you, or just sit in front of you, or sit behind you, hold you, or whatever would feel good. See if you can just close your eyes and just maybe put your hand on your heart, give yourself some touch, maybe some rubbing, and just start to feel into, like, wow, what are the hardest parts about being me? What are the hardest parts about being human, being alive? When I think about the different forms of suffering in the world around me, what really hits me? What impacts me most? What cause, what thing happening to people out there in the world, or people I know, or myself? What really hits me most deeply? Like, that's not right. And it's not about making it better. It's not about fixing it. It's about just fully feeling it. Wow, this is true. This is what is happening in reality. And what might come out as tears, what might come out as anger, all sorts of things. For me at the ritual, I actually had very few tears. I had a lot of anger. I just wanted to pound the ground and press against the ground really hard. Like, this isn't right. And that felt really good to just let that out. Because I think it really is it's a body thing. It's a nervous system thing. Like, I had this tension inside me. This grief that just needed to be let out, pressed out. So see if you can find something in you that wants to be pressed, or wants to be collapsed and just cried out, or whatever it is. It might help to listen to some music that evokes strong feelings in you, or to look at a photo album, or there are many gateways to access this. But whatever you do, I hope that you can, hope that this video maybe has inspired you to explore grief. Because I think it's such an important healing pathway for us. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a nourishing day.